Hello and welcome to the fourth session of the INSEAD SDG Week 2021. Today we're very lucky to have Professor Koh Liang Ping from the National University of Singapore for a great presentation called How Science Helps Inform Sustainable Policies and Decisions in Climate and Biodiversity, followed by Q&A with the audience. So input your questions as we go along and we'll have time at the end to cover them. This presentation is particularly timely in the context of COP26, with net zero initiatives being announced at the moment, and the growing push for ESG and sustainability. It is all the more important to get a good grounding in the science. So it's great to have the professor with us. Professor Koh is a professor of conservation science, technology and policy, and the director of the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at NUS, which integrates world-class research, thought leadership and education on nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation in the Asia-Pacific region. Professor Koh is an applied ecologist with 16 years of international research experience in the field of sustainability and environmental science, having worked in institutions across Switzerland, Australia, and the United States. He is one of the most highly cited conservation scientists in Asia, a nominated member of parliament in Singapore, a TED Global speaker, and a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. He's also a pioneer in low-cost conservation drone technology and founding director of conservationdrones.org. It's my pleasure to introduce him, and with this, I'd like to hand over for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alexander. And I hope you can hear me well and you can see my title slide. Very good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be watching us from. It is really a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here today. I have to thank the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, and also to Alexander Hoffman himself for hosting this event and for the very kind introduction earlier. I think this is a very timely seminar, given that COP26 is happening as we speak, and that there have been quite a few exciting announcements already over the last couple of days. And the one that I'm most excited about and also very happy to hear about was the one announced, I think, yesterday or the day before, on the declaration or the commitment by over 120 countries to stop deforestation by 2030. So that's really exciting, and it's also it also aligns very well with what I'll be sharing with you today. I'll be talking about some of the recent research from our Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at the National University of Singapore. I think the sharing of knowledge of science and technology across academia, public and private sectors in our region and indeed across the world is important because that will ensure that we can collectively and effectively address the emerging threats of climate change and other environmental issues that we are facing, as well as to allow us to capitalize on new opportunities that these challenges may also present to us. So my presentation today will focus on climate change as a wicked problem, but I will also highlight some of the new opportunities that we can look forward to as well. I think many of us here might remember Secretary Rumsfeld making his famous or infamous statement back in 2002. Secretary Rumsfeld was, of course, talking about a completely different context. But sometimes I think it's useful to think about the subject matter in terms of what we know and what we know we don't know. So I will break my presentation up into three main parts. The first part is on what we know about climate change and nature-based solutions. The second part will be on what we are beginning to find out. And the third part is on what we don't know at the moment, but urgently need to find out. So let's begin with the first part. What do we know? I think we know the problem quite well. If we take the annual average temperature of the planet over the last 170 years or so, color code them on a temperature scale of blue to red, as you see here, indicating cooler to warmer temperatures. This is what we will see, and this is what we call the climate stripes, and that some of you may have already seen before in other media. If we look at the data for individual countries, and for me, I'll be looking at countries in the region of Southeast Asia, we see a very similar trend. So today, it is not controversial anymore that our climate has been getting increasingly warmer at local, regional, and global levels. I think we know the cause of this problem quite well too. It is simply the accumulation of CO2, carbon dioxide, as well as other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. On this graph, you see here, the blue line shows global annual emissions. It is now close to about 40 billion tons per year. The pink line shows global CO2 emissions, or concentration rather. It is now over 400 parts per million. So we know the problem and we know the cause of the problem. I think we actually also know the solution. Basically, we have to reverse what we had done in the past 170 years by reducing our emissions to effectively zero. And according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to do that within the next 30 years, if not sooner, if we are to achieve the Paris climate goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, we need to go below zero to also remove and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we have already been emitting or have emitted in the past to our atmosphere. And that's why you see some of the lines on this IPCC graph going below zero. In fact, the blue lines you see on this IPCC graph indicate different pathways for us to achieve the Paris climate goal. We'll come back to these pathways later. In Singapore, we are very serious in taking a whole-of-nation approach to addressing climate change by committing to several ambitious targets. Earlier this year, the Singapore Parliament declared climate change a global emergency, along with a slew of other green transformation and green growth strategies as part of the Singapore Green Plan 2030. Following that, the government also announced that Sentosa, one of Singapore's most famous tourist attractions, will become carbon neutral by 2030. And not soon after, Singapore Airlines also pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So clearly, Singapore is very serious in what we are taking, the approaches we are taking to address climate change. However, given the very short runway ahead of us, meeting these goals will not be easy. But thankfully, Singapore is not alone, because at the global level, we obviously also need to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century if we are to meet the target of the Paris Climate Agreement. So to help us get started, let's go back to one of the IPCC pathways. This is pathway P3, which represents a middle-of-the-road scenario on how we are going to achieve the Paris climate goal. As you can see here on this graph, for the world to achieve net zero emissions by around mid-century, we will have to peak our emissions by 2021, followed by rapid decarbonization, which is represented by the gray part of the pathway. Now, decarbonization would involve transitions away from fossil fuel use, increasing our energy efficiency, reducing waste, and so on. But just as importantly, if not more importantly, we also need to act on the brown part of the pathway. The brown part above the zero line represents opportunities over the next 10 years or so to reduce emissions, mainly by avoiding deforestation. And the brown part below the zero line are opportunities for us to start to remove emissions, mainly by reforestation or rehabilitating our degraded ecosystems. And together, these are the so-called nature-based climate solutions. Nature-based climate solutions are important, but they're not just important. They are, in fact, recognized to be an integral part of the solution. As you can see here, they are baked into every of these IPCC pathways for us to achieve the Paris climate goal. In other words, even if we manage to decarbonize, to act on the gray part of the curves, we could still fall short of our targets unless we also figure out the science and the practice of implementing these nature-based solutions, which are the brown part of every pathway. Let's move on to part two. So what are we beginning to find out? This is another famous person you may recognize. Dr. Fauci famously said that numbers don't lie, but numbers can and do change over time as we improve our understanding of the world through science. So what I'm about to present to you are some preliminary research and findings from our research. Some of these results may not be published, some may not be publishable, and some of the data and information may also evolve and improve over time as we get more insights. But this initial information and the initial results that I would be presenting to you are useful to help us understand what we should be focusing on and where some of the opportunities and risks might lie. Let's start with the issue of scale. What is the scale of our solution versus the scale of our problem? As I mentioned earlier, global carbon emissions is currently at about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. And here I've also included the annual emissions of China, the United States, Indonesia, and Singapore, just for comparison. Recent research from our center at the National University of Singapore shows that by protecting threatened forests across the tropics, we can already avoid the loss of almost 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. This is greater than the emissions of Indonesia and Singapore combined. Our research also shows that by protecting just one particular type of forests, and these are the threatened mangrove forests across the tropics, we can avoid the loss of some 30 million tons of CO2 per year. So that is also quite significant if we just act on one particular type of forests. But that is not all. If we focus on just the urban environment, our research shows that across about 7,600 cities worldwide, there are almost 11 million hectares of urban green spaces within these cities that are potentially available for reforestation. And if we reforest these green spaces in those cities, they could contribute to carbon sequestration. They could start to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a rate of about 80 million tons of CO2 per year at the global level. So the take-home message here is forest protection and reforestation, including in our cities, are an important part of our climate change mitigation strategy. Now, from the perspective of a policymaker or investor, it may not be enough to know what that potential is. They often also need to know where the potential lies so they can make more informed investment and other business decisions. So we also produced a carbon prospecting map. So we call this a prospecting map because we see carbon as another commodity. So instead of prospecting for oil and gas or precious metals or minerals, we are now prospecting for carbon as a commodity. So on this carbon prospecting map that we produced, we can see where in the world one can invest in forest protection to avoid carbon emissions. And as you can see on this map, much of the potential lies in South America and Southeast Asia. In fact, Indonesia and Malaysia are among the top 5 countries in the world where we can avoid the most emissions by protecting their threatened forests. Now, I'm a biologist, I'm a conservation biologist. So from a biodiversity conservation perspective, this map also tells us where forests are under threat and where we can invest to avoid the loss of both carbon and biodiversity by protecting those forests. Now, interestingly, if we focus only on mangrove forests, that particular type of forests I talked about earlier, focusing only on mangrove forests, as this map from another recent research shows, we find that the bulk of this so-called blue carbon potential is also found in our region of Southeast Asia. Now, it's called blue carbon, obviously, because it's carbon found in coastal marine ecosystems, and hence it's called blue carbon, as opposed to green carbon, which we used to refer to the more inland terrestrial forests. But this research finding on mangrove forests is actually not very surprising, given that we live in a very archipelagic region with lots of islands and coastlines, and where there are still lots of mangrove forests that are under threat or loss from threats of loss from human activities, and as well as the other associated environmental impacts. So I've shown you the potential climate mitigation potential of green carbon and blue carbon. But it's important to note at this point that not all of these carbon projects, although they're investable, and not all of these investable carbon projects are profitable carbon projects. Because like any other economic activity, a carbon project's financial viability depends on many factors, a wide range of factors, including, of course, the price of carbon, which is currently, it ranges from a few, $2, $3 per ton to maybe $10, $20 per ton. But on average, it's around $5 to $6 per ton carbon. So it depends on the price of carbon and the costs of establishment, maintenance, and operation. So a whole lot of other factors would affect the financial viability and the profitability of a carbon project. And of course, policymakers and business leaders would be interested in these issues as well, the financial return on investment of nature-based carbon projects. And that is exactly what we worked on next. Based on very conservative carbon pricing scenarios of about $5 to $6 per ton of carbon, we find that the Asia-Pacific region has the highest concentration of the most profitable carbon projects, which could generate return on investment at close to $25 billion in net present value per year, every year, for the next 30 years, based on a project lifespan of about 30 years. And Indonesia alone can generate $10 billion per year, again, every year for the next 30 years. So the returns can be quite significant. But what I personally find most interesting and perhaps also most worrying about our findings are the yellow parts you see on this map, because the yellow parts on the map represent regions that are not financially viable as carbon projects, mainly because these forests do not generate enough carbon credits to offset the costs of establishing and maintaining them as carbon projects. And so from a nature conservation, a biodiversity conservation perspective, we urgently need other policy interventions to protect the vast majority of these threatened forests. So that's another important finding from our research. Now, on this earlier slide, I also mentioned that the reforestation of our urban green spaces, what we do in cities, can also be a kind of nature-based climate solution. And so we also conducted a spatially explicit analysis of cities. We mapped out the potential of cities for sequestering carbon. Interestingly, we find that not all cities would benefit equally from the reforestation of their green spaces. In fact, cities with the greatest carbon sequestration potential, the greatest potential for capturing, removing carbon from the atmosphere, are cities that are concentrated in Central and South America, coastal West Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Another interesting finding from our study is that although the climate mitigation potential of urban reforestation may be limited at the global level, as I mentioned earlier, it's about 80 million tons of CO2 per year, so quite limited compared to the amount of emissions that we are experiencing, 40 billion tons per year. At the global level, it may be limited, but urban reforestation can be particularly important for some cities at the city level. For example, we find that for about 1,200 cities worldwide, 1,200 cities worldwide, the reforestation of their available green spaces can offset more than a quarter, more than 25% of the city's local carbon emissions. Reforestation in cities, within cities, can be important to offset the emissions of these cities for some cities. Now, I've talked a lot about the potential of nature-based solutions through either forest protection or reforestation. And at this point, I'd like to highlight another important consideration, which is that these theoretical potential for climate change mitigation can be quite different. They have to be viewed through the lens of what may actually be achievable on the ground, what the practicalities might be on the ground. Because there will always be practical constraints in particular nations or provinces or villages, indeed, that are specific to these local or regional contexts that need to be considered. To talk about constraints, let me focus more on reforestation in general as a climate solution. Recently, we also mapped the potential for reforestation in Southeast Asia. And we find that in our region of Southeast Asia, there are about 121 million hectares of degraded forests, peat swamp forests, and mangrove forests that are biophysically suitable for reforestation. So these are lands that used to be pristine natural forests, and they might have been converted to agriculture or forestry, and subsequently they might have been abandoned and now are available, at least biophysically available for reforestation, to plant trees and reverting back to their native state. And if we do that, the restoration of these degraded lands could potentially remove about 3.4 billion tons of CO2 per year. So quite significant at the global level. However, these so-called degraded lands may in fact be used by local communities as smallholder farmlands or home gardens. So these local communities could be growing crops for their own subsistence, not necessarily food, or for sale in local markets. And if a government or a business were to appropriate these lands for reforestation, that could severely compromise the livelihoods, the food security, and the land rights of these land users. Furthermore, deforestation, as I mentioned earlier, is like any other development project, right? And they will require a constant maintenance and protection against threats, including tree diebacks from diseases, including illegal logging, including forest fires and other natural disasters. So as we begin to apply these different layers of constraints and considerations, we find that the picture starts to change as well. The amount of land that is practically available for reforestation can very quickly shrink from what we thought was 120 million hectares to less than 8 million hectares across the region. And in the most constrained scenario, reforestation would remove less than 0.25 billion tons of CO2 per year, which is literally a fraction of the unconstrained potential, what we thought would be 3.4 billion tons per year. So why should we care about these new insights and knowledge, and why should we bother about these numbers and the science of it all? I think these insights are important because they tell us where there might be opportunities for countries and companies in our region and indeed across the tropics to reduce and to remove our emissions, or perhaps even invest in generating nature-based carbon credits to capitalize on new economic opportunities. But just as importantly, the science can also alert us to what some of the constraints and risks might be, constraints that are specific to our region. And therefore, I think it makes good sense for us to invest in producing such policy relevant science in this area to better inform policy and business decisions when it comes to climate strategies and actions. Now let's continue on to part 3. For this part, I will run through a few slides to give you a flavor of some of the priority research questions that our center is tackling next. Now, nature-based solutions in general are important, not just for carbon storage and sequestration, but also for the multiple co-benefits they deliver to society. Some of these co-benefits include biodiversity conservation, water and air purification, safeguarding the food security of the local communities or the country, flood regulation, and so on. So another piece of ongoing research at our center is focused on mapping these various co-benefits of nature-based solutions across Southeast Asia, again, to better inform our policy and business decisions on where to prioritize, for example, where to prioritize our investments. And of course, green spaces in cities also provide multiple co-benefits, including conserving wildlife, maintaining our physical and mental well-being, which I think many of us appreciate during this COVID situation, improving social cohesion, as well as reducing our exposure to air pollutants, to noise, and to heat. Now, among the many co-benefits of nature-based solutions, biodiversity is interesting. It's particularly interesting because it is both a co-benefit as well as a building block of healthy ecosystems. When we invest in protecting a forest, we protect its biodiversity. Conversely, a high diversity of animals, of plants, of microbes in the forest ensures that the forest continues to perform its ecosystem functions, not only to sustain itself, but also to deliver important ecosystem services to humans, including the services of carbon sequestration and storage that we are talking about today. At the moment, this value of biodiversity is not properly reflected or internalized in how we price carbon. 1 ton of carbon from a monoculture can be priced the same as 1 ton of carbon from a highly diverse, pristine rainforest today. But we know intuitively that the carbon from the pristine forest is so much more valuable than the carbon from the monoculture. So our team is also exploring ways to quantify the price premium of what we call this beautiful carbon from natural intact ecosystems. So far, we have focused on green carbon, which are the terrestrial forests, as well as blue carbon, which are the mangroves. But there are also several other kinds of high carbon ecosystems in the carbon rainbow that have received less attention, including teal carbon. Teal carbon are the freshwater swamp forests and the peat swamp forests. So these are inland forests, but waterlogged. So the water is trapped in this forest, and that prevents the decomposition of the leaf litter, and that traps the carbon underneath the water or in the water. And that makes these ecosystems very, very carbon dense. And then there are the gold carbon systems, which are the macroalgae or seaweeds, which are also very have very high rates of carbon sequestration. So we need to study all of these different high carbon ecosystems in the carbon rainbow. And more importantly, we need to understand interconnectedness and the interdependence between these ecosystems to fully appreciate the climate change mitigation potential and co-benefits that these other high carbon ecosystems provide. It is partly because of the many benefits and co-benefits of nature-based solutions that I had mentioned, that nature-based carbon offsets or credits are the most highly sought after product in voluntary carbon markets today. In fact, nature-based carbon credits are 3 times more expensive than renewable energy credits. Now, given this growing global demand for nature-based carbon offsets, Singapore is positioning ourselves as a global carbon trading hub for carbon-related services, with a focus on nature-based carbon projects and products. Having said all of that, how wonderful nature-based, how wonderful and important nature-based carbon projects are, nature-based solutions are, I have to now say that they are certainly not without risks. Earlier this year, if some of you may have paid attention, there have been several controversial media reports on how certain suppliers of forest carbon credits may have been selling meaningless carbon offsets to big corporations, including some very famous businesses. Offsets that don't actually deliver any additional climate mitigation benefits. So that was quite a big scandal in the voluntary carbon markets earlier this year. At NUS, at the National University of Singapore, we are also working hard to understand these risks and to try to mitigate these risks. And here is a typology of the risks of nature-based carbon projects. I won't go into the details here except to say that these risks include inaccuracies in the estimates of carbon stocks and sequestration rates, uncertainties in the value add or the additionality of carbon projects as an intervention, uncertainties around the permanence or rather the impermanence of projects and products, as well as the potential leakage of environmental impacts. And leakage is where, if you protect one forest or one part of a forest, you may simply be diverting development and deforestation to another part of the forest or another country altogether, resulting in no net benefit from your intervention, from your investment. So these risks can affect the credibility of the project as well as the environmental integrity of its products, the carbon credits. Having said that, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. As we had discussed earlier, nature-based climate solutions are essential for us to achieve the Paris climate goal. Carbon finance is a very promising and important way of shifting capital to fund forest protection and reforestation efforts, but because not all carbon projects are effective or of equal quality. That's why we need to have new or very high carbon accounting, very good carbon accounting methodologies and high standards to ensure the credibility and the integrity of these nature-based carbon projects and products. Only then can we ensure a stable supply of the highest quality carbon credits to meet market demands. And that is exactly what our center is focused on through one of our new research programs called Nature for Climate, which ultimately seeks to leverage the opportunity that nature-based solutions provide to achieve our desired outcome of realizing the potential of nature-based solutions or projects to meet market demands for carbon offset credits. So in the first part of this presentation, I have shared some of the research that our center at NUS has been involved in over the past few months. I will now just spend the last few slides talking a bit and introducing who we actually are. The Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions is quite a young research facility. We've only been around for about 1.5 years. We have 2 main goals. The first is to produce data-driven science to inform climate policies, decisions, and actions in Singapore and the wider Asia-Pacific region. The second and equally important goal is to empower leadership to build capacity in our public, our private, and our people sectors by, of course, education, by outreach and science communications, for us to respond to climate challenges and the opportunities that may emerge. With this center, we are bringing together researchers from across very different disciplines, departments, faculties, and even universities to pool our resources and expertise to work towards the common goal. We involve researchers from other IHLs, from other institutes of higher learnings in Singapore as well as overseas. And also we are advised by an esteemed group of senior scientists from some of the top universities around the world who serve on our scientific advisory board. The research interests and expertise of the center's researchers are very diverse, as you can see here. They include marine biology to mangrove ecology, to remote sensing, to environmental policy, governance, and law. Our center invests in 5 areas of strategic research. The first is to understand the impacts of climate change on our economy, environment, and society. The second is to understand the extent by which nature-based solutions can reduce carbon emissions or remove CO2 from the atmosphere and help to increase our climate resilience. And I have shared some of our initial research findings from this pillar over the last couple of slides. The third research pillar or research focal area is to understand the economic, the societal, the policy and political barriers to the uptake of nature-based solutions and the ways by which we could potentially overcome some of these barriers. The fourth area, research area, is to understand what solutions to prioritize, where to invest, and how to do it to get the biggest bang for our buck. And finally, the third research pillar is, the last research pillar is on technology, which is a cross-cutting theme. And we want to understand how to leverage technology to improve the credibility and integrity of our solutions, to reduce the costs of implementation, and also how to use technology to best facilitate communications, education, and outreach. To tackle those research questions, we use a wide range of research techniques. We collect empirical data through lab work, field work, and remote sensing. And those data are critical for our analytical work to map, to monitor, and to inform the optimization and prioritization of our solutions. In the first year of the research establishment, in 2020, last year, we have been focusing our research efforts on a few priority research questions, which I had shared with you earlier. Looking ahead, we continue to focus on understanding some of the co-benefits of nature-based solutions on blue carbon, as well as on how we could leverage technology to improve the credibility and integrity of these nature-based carbon projects and offsets. In addition to research, our center also proactively works with local public-facing partners and organizations for outreach and education. For example, we work with Sentosa Corporation, we work with the zoo, with the bird park, we work with Gardens by the Bay to bring our science to the constituents of these partner organizations to help educate them and gain more public acceptance of the policies and solutions that may be introduced to address climate change impacts that we are facing as a society. Of course, we can't do any of this alone. We engage with stakeholders from across academia, government, corporate, and the NGO sectors. And we work with all these different stakeholders, both locally as well as internationally, to collaborate and to leverage our respective strengths to achieve our goals. And with that, I've come to my last slide. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ko. That was really a great presentation. You really broke it down for us in quite an approachable way. Maybe I can start with just a question on my side, which I think is a piece that the audience will appreciate, is what are some of the differences you find between kind of working with governments versus working with businesses? What part do businesses have to play in this, and is there something you'd like to share with us regarding that in your experience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the excellent question, Alexander. So obviously, I think the capital lies with the private sector, right? So the businesses have a lot of potential to use their resources to support many of the solutions that I talked about. Forest protection projects or reforestation projects across the many regions that are highlighted. But I think the private sector alone cannot achieve the desired outcomes because they also require the enabling environment, the policy environment for many of these solutions to work, especially if it involves changing some of the business as usual or changing the status quo of how production is happening across many parts of the tropics. I can give you a concrete example. In our part of the world, we have many parts of our lands in Southeast Asia that is being used for agriculture and forestry, oil palm agriculture, pulp and paper forestry, very big industries. At the moment, many of these industry players are actually beginning to think about how they might want to transition at least part of their businesses to carbon projects, setting aside part of the concession, not for production anymore, but actually for protection or reforestation. But they cannot do this without the support of the government, without the support of the public sector that has to create the policy instruments to change some of the policies to allow them to do that. So I think in that sense, so this is a good example to illustrate how the public and the private sector need to work together. But we should not forget the people sector too, because as the public and private sectors work together to implement these carbon projects, there are lots of important social issues that need to be addressed. Indeed, other environmental issues as well, biodiversity issues and so on. So the NGO sector also needs to come into play to make sure that safeguards are in place to protect biodiversity, that the benefits trickle down to the communities, that the communities are not disenfranchised and so on. So that's why I emphasized in my presentation how the public, the private, and the people sectors need to work together.
Great, thank you very much. I think that also answers one of the questions we had around the local communities that are near these carbon projects. Sort of how can they be involved? Do they play a role? This was a question from Ricardo Roche around this, and if there is investment in these regions, how do they stand to kind of benefit from that?
Yeah, so I could just supplement my answers to the first question, maybe just by saying that we've actually been approached by quite a few of these small holders or small land owners who are also beginning to get interested in this whole carbon trading or carbon markets, interesting carbon markets in general, and they're approaching us to understand the potential of their lands or their forests for generating carbon credits and so on. So I think as researchers, our role in this is to produce the science, the information that could help inform these decisions, even the decisions of the small landholders. But of course, ultimately, at the practical level, they would have to potentially work with their local governments or even the businesses in their local communities or regional communities to implement, to get the resourcing and the support to implement these solutions at the local level.
Perfect, thank you. Just to move on now with some of the assessments that have been made around the various reforestation projects on whether they're worth investing, what's the profitability of that? Is there, what are some of the attributes that you look at for that, especially when it comes to mangroves? And then kind of, is there a regional difference in the types of green spaces that exist, or the trees that are in that region? Or is it how do you basically quantify that between the different colors of carbon that there are?
That's an excellent question. That also speaks to how important it is to have our decisions be informed by robust science, because the fact of the matter is many of these reforestation projects in the past have failed, for various reasons. Sometimes it's because the reforestation is taking place at a location that is not suitable for reforestation, and biophysically just not suitable for reforestation. The conditions are not right, or the wrong species of trees are planted at that location, at the right location, wrong species of trees or plants. Sometimes it's because that particular site might be prone to forest fires, for example, or other natural disasters. There could be local political reasons. Publicly available, so anyone can go to our publications or our websites and so on to look at their particular region and try to see if the sites might be suitable for reforestation. And we are also working to digitalize some of this information into a dashboard so that people can more easily access the information. But this is only to some extent that we can do this. The resolution of our information is still quite coarse. It's quite rough because we're looking at it at the regional scale. We can point to certain priority areas to maybe take a closer look. Areas with potential. We can point to certain areas that you might want to avoid right at the get-go because of certain problems. But when it comes to actually wanting to commit to making any business decisions or policy decisions, I think the stakeholders ultimately has to go down to the ground to that particular site and understand the conditions of those sites, the biophysical conditions, the socioeconomic conditions, the policy conditions, before they make their decisions on any carbon project.
Great, thank you. I have another question here from Joseph regarding actually, so when you make that assessment, when you look at kind of the situation on the ground and things like that, how might you balance the need for, let's say, investment today for carbon projects that are going to have potentially a longer kind of period before they actually can start absorbing carbon? Is there from a kind of financial perspective, is there a system that works best for kind of enabling that type of exchange, let's say?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on, again, thanks for that great question. It depends very much on the nature of the project. Right? So if we're talking about growing a new forest, reforestation, then it would be akin to growing a new crop or establishing a new agricultural plantation, whereby in the first few years you will have to wait for the crops to mature, right? So similarly for a reforestation project, there will be a first few years, maybe the first 5 to 10 years, depending on the location and the type, the species of trees that you're planting, where the sequestration rate might be, the amount of carbon that's sequestered might be quite low, and then that might ramp up towards the later years as the forest matures and so on. So it's just like any other agriculture activity, and so there would be some upfront costs to be considered, but then the returns might come later on. So that's for reforestation. But when you think about the other type of nature-based project of forest protection, whereby there would already be a standing forest, a mature forest, and what you are actually investing in is to invest in protecting the forest to ensure that the standing forest remains standing for the next 30 years. So it's a lot about how you would enforce the protection, to ensure that there's no illegal logging, to ensure that the trees, the forests continue to remain healthy, and so on and so forth. So for that type of forest protection projects or RED projects, REDD projects, it's also called, the carbon stocks are already in place. So right from the get-go, you would be able to derive the whatever analyze carbon credits over the lifetime of the project, average to a particular year. The amount of credits that would be generated if you successfully protect the forest for that 1 year or for that 2 years. So in that sense, the returns might be you might be able to see the returns much sooner than a reforestation project. So it really depends on the type of the project.
Great, thank you. I have one question here, which I think is really very interesting, and I'd love to know kind of what you think about this from Dimitri, regarding the fact that some geographies are more fertile than others for like the absorption of CO2 and things like that. Does that would that prevent the trading freely across the world, or is this something where you know, some places that are less fertile, such as maybe the Middle East in the example here, how might they participate in this activity of reforestation and regeneration? I wonder if you have any ideas around that.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So maybe I'll also take the opportunity to just at least very briefly describe how a carbon project would be implemented. So it is all very site specific. Every site is different, and every site requires the project developer or the investor to invest in developing a PDD, a project design document for that project. It's just like any other development project. So you have to send your team down or engage a contractor to send their team down to essentially to measure the amount of carbon that is on site, if it is a forest protection project where there are standing forests. If it's a reforestation project, then your scientists that you send down would have to do their research to estimate the amount of carbon that would be sequestered, that would grow essentially every year over the 20 or 30 year lifespan of the project. And that rate of growth would depend on the site. Some places would be more fertile than others naturally, and then the sequestration rate will be a lot higher. Also depends on the type of forest, right? So mangrove forest, for example, famously very high sequestration rates compared to other types of terrestrial forests. So a lot of factors will be at play, and it's always very site specific. You go down to the project, build the project design document, and then you have the auditors come in to certify the project, to make sure that to validate the project, to make sure that what you put down in the document is accurate. And then after a few years, have the auditors come in again to verify the project, to verify that you actually did deliver on the amount of carbon over the last 1 year or 2 years, the first 1 year or 2 years. And then it becomes a fully certified carbon project. And then you can trade your certified carbon credits in most voluntary markets. So that's the process of how a certified carbon project happens. Of course, there are also some carbon projects where they are less bothered with certifying their project, so they would just plant some trees and not have them be certified. And there are willing buyers of such uncertified carbon projects. It really depends on what the goal of the buyer might be. But for certified carbon projects, this is that is the process I described. This is how it would work, and that the process of designing the project and implementing the project would capture the site-specific attributes of the project. And ultimately, what you would be trading are the carbon credits. So it's, however many tons of carbon credits generated for the project. And so these credits would be fungible to a large extent in voluntary carbon markets.
Great. Okay, I think we're close to time. Let me just ask you one final question around kind of how these assignments of the value of nature-based solutions can happen in terms of purely in terms of let's say like a currency value. So we've seen there's the carbon offset side, but I'm wondering, is there how have you managed to kind of assess all the other benefits that come also with kind of having an area that is let's say biodiversity strong in terms of biodiversity?
Yeah, so there are, at the moment, there's no standardized way of doing it. I think most people are trying to capture the other values of a carbon project by allowing the market to determine the price of that carbon. So if there are enough buyers out there who value biodiversity, who value what the project is doing in terms of supporting local communities, then they would be willing to pay a higher price for those kinds of projects and credits coming from those kinds of projects. To some extent, there are ways of quasi-certifying those other values, in that there are additional standards that the project developers could go to, could apply for, for example, you can have more than one label for your product, as in any other commodity or product, right? You can have a gold standard, but then you can have another label or standard that you also subscribe to and satisfy the requirements for, that may have something to do with how biodiverse the project is, or how much it benefits the local communities. And so you can have a variety of these different labels for your products, and then let the market decide how much they are willing to pay for the quality of your project and products based on the number of these labels or standards that you are able to meet the requirements for. So at the moment, that is how carbon prices are being determined. But then having said that, if buyers don't care, if most buyers don't care for all these other values, then no matter how many labels you have, they don't add much to the price of the carbon of the product. So it's really a market driven, I think, how the prices are determined at the moment. Great.
Thank you very much for answering that. Good. I think that's all that we have time for today. Thank you. The number of questions shows me that this is really a topic that people are very interested in, and this is clearly something that we all need to understand as we go forward, because there's going to be more and more of this in the future, with businesses and governments kind of working together on this across countries as well, which I think is very exciting, especially in the Asia region. So thank you so much for your presentation today, Professor Ko. Thank you. For the audience, please stick around for the rest of the week. We have lots of sessions coming up, including the next one will be with Paul Polman at 1 p.m. So please don't miss that. It's also with the Environment and Business Club. Thank you very much for participating. And when the webinar finishes, there will be a survey as well. Please do take a few moments to fill that out because it's very helpful. And if you are wanting to talk about this session on your social medias, please take the step of tagging the INSEAD Business and Society accounts, as you can see here, on the respective social networks. With that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much again to our speaker, Professor Ko, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.